At 5:47 a.m. in Harrow, when most of London still slept, Livia's hands were already trembling, not from the cold, but from counting coins that would never be enough. The copper pennies scattered across her tiny kitchen table like fallen leaves, each one a small reminder of dreams that felt impossibly distant. £23.47. Not enough for rent. Not enough for anything, really. The Morning Brew Cafe key felt heavy in her palm as she stepped into the gray October morning, her worn sneakers silent against the damp pavement. The familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against her shoulders. Another sleepless night spent calculating, recalculating, hoping that somehow the numbers would magically transform themselves into something livable. Inside the cafe, fluorescent bulbs hummed to life, washing everything in harsh white light. Livia moved through her morning ritual with practiced precision. Brewing the first pot of coffee, arranging yesterday's pastries behind glass that needed cleaning, checking the temperature on the ancient espresso machine that wheezed like an old man with troubled lungs. Her reflection, caught in the chrome surface, hollow-cheeked, eyes that had seen too much worry for someone barely 26. The envelope from her landlord crinkled in her apron pocket. Final notice. The words burned through the thin paper like a brand. 3 months behind, with threats of eviction crawling closer each day. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over her mother's contact in Prague. The conversation would be the same, concern wrapped in disappointment, questions about when she'd give up this English dream and come home to sensible work, sensible life, sensible surrender. "You are too stubborn, Levinka," her mother's voice echoed in her memory, using the childhood name that now felt like a ghost from another life. "London will eat you alive." But stubborn was all Livia had left. Stubborn had carried her from a cramped apartment in Prague, where dreams went to die, through months of language barriers and cultural confusion, to this small corner of Harrow where she could at least pretend that tomorrow might be different. Her English had improved from broken phrases to fluid conversation, but her bank account remained frozen in permanent winter. She arranged the porcelain cups with careful attention, each placement deliberate. This cafe wasn't much. Mismatched furniture, walls that needed fresh paint, a coffee machine older than some of her customers. But it was hers in the way that mattered. The way home feels when you've created it from nothing but hope and relentless determination. The morning light began filtering through rain-streaked windows, casting shifting patterns across wooden tables that had absorbed countless conversations, countless small human dramas. Soon the regulars would arrive. Mrs. Henderson with her crossword puzzle, the construction workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, the young mother who always looked as tired as Livia felt. A stack of bills waited by the register like patient predators. Gas, electric, rent, phone, each one demanding attention she couldn't afford to give. She'd been here before, balanced on this knife's edge between making it and losing everything. The difference was that back in Prague, failure meant moving back in with family. Here, failure meant sleeping rough on London streets that showed no mercy to dreamers who couldn't pay their way. Her fingertips traced the edge of a university brochure she kept hidden beneath the register. Evening classes in social work, a degree that might lead somewhere meaningful. The tuition fees might as well have been written in gold ink for all the accessibility they offered. But she kept the brochure anyway, a secret promise to herself that someday wouldn't always mean never. The coffee aroma filled the small space, rich and dark and full of possibility. This was her sanctuary, her battlefield, her stage where she performed the daily miracle of surviving in a city that devoured the unprepared. Every smile she offered customers was genuine. Every good morning carried the warmth of someone who understood what it meant to need kindness from strangers. Her watch showed 7:43 a.m. Soon the morning rush would begin, and she'd lose herself in the beautiful chaos of serving tea and toast to people living their own complicated stories. For now, though, the cafe belonged entirely to her, a quiet space where a girl from Eastern Europe could believe that hard work and compassion might actually be enough. What she didn't know was that in exactly 2 hours and 28 minutes, a stranger would change everything. He arrived on a Tuesday morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., like clockwork, wrapped in a worn navy coat that had seen better decades. Livia noticed him immediately, not because he was remarkable, but because he moved through the cafe's morning chaos with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world quietly. The gentleman chose the corner table by the window, the one most customers avoided because it wobbled slightly and caught the draft. He folded his newspaper with military precision, creasing each edge until it lay flat as parchment. His order never varied. Black tea, no sugar, served in the white porcelain cup rather than the blue one. He never explained this preference, but Livia remembered. His hands told stories he never spoke aloud. Weathered fingers that trembled slightly when he lifted his cup, wedding ring worn thin from decades of unconscious turning, a small scar across his thumb that caught the morning light. When he held his teacup, it was with both palms wrapped around the warmth, as if drawing comfort from something deeper than the simple ritual of drinking. Week after week, the pattern continued. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, always 8:15, always the same table. Other customers came and went in waves of conversation and hurried footsteps, but he remained constant as the sunrise, reading his paper with eyes that seemed to absorb more than just news. Livia found herself setting aside the steadiest table setting for him, ensuring his cup was spotless, that his corner remained available even during the busiest rushes. She couldn't explain why this mattered, only that some instinct whispered that this quiet man needed consistency in a world that had perhaps offered him too little of it. Gradually, carefully, words began to emerge between them. Never rushed, never forced, just gentle observations that grew into something resembling conversation. He mentioned the weather with the authority of someone who had watched many seasons pass. She shared small details about the cafe, how the espresso machine had its own personality, how regulars became part of her daily landscape. "You have kind eyes," he told her one October morning, his voice carrying traces of an accent she couldn't place. "They remind me of someone I once knew." The comment hung between them like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. Livia felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from recognition of something deeper. The way he looked at her sometimes, as if seeing past the uniform and the tired smile to something that mattered. His newspaper became a window into fragments of his thoughts. He read the obituaries first, always, his finger tracing down columns of names with an intensity that suggested he was searching for someone specific. Death notices from years past lay folded in his coat pocket, edges soft from handling. When he thought no one was watching, he would unfold these carefully, reading words that clearly held weight beyond their simple text. "I used to care for someone," he said one Thursday apropos of nothing, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "A lifetime ago, it feels. She would have liked this place, the warmth of it." Livia waited, sensing there was more, but he retreated into silence as complete as snow. These glimpses came rarely. Mentions of laughter that once filled empty rooms, of hands that had once reached for his across dinner tables, of mornings when he hadn't woken up alone. She began to understand that his visits weren't really about the tea or the newspaper. They were about bearing witness to life continuing around him, about maintaining connection to a world that had shifted beneath his feet in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The cafe provided what he needed most. A place where his presence mattered, where someone noticed if he seemed more tired than usual, where kindness asked nothing in return. Sometimes she caught him watching her work, not with inappropriate interest, but with the gentle attention of someone who recognized dedication when he saw it. His eyes held depths that spoke of loss, transformed into something resembling acceptance, though the transformation remained incomplete. The corner table became his sanctuary, and by extension, hers. In serving him, she discovered that caring for others filled spaces in her own heart she hadn't realized were empty. Neither knew they were already family. November 15th arrived, wrapped in gray clouds that pressed against the cafe windows like worried faces. The morning had passed in its usual rhythm, but something felt different in the air, a heaviness that made conversations quieter, movements more deliberate. Even the coffee machine seemed to hum with unusual urgency. Gideon occupied his corner table as always, but Livia noticed subtle changes that sent whispers of concern through her chest. His newspaper lay unfolded beside his untouched tea, and his weathered hands rested flat against the wooden surface, as if anchoring himself to something solid. The careful composure he wore like armor had developed hairline cracks. The lunch crowd had thinned to scattered individuals, absorbed in their phones and laptops when Livia glanced toward his table again. What she saw froze her mid-step. Gideon's face had drained of all color, leaving behind skin the shade of old parchment. His fingers clutched the table's edge with desperate intensity, knuckles white as bone. Their eyes met across the cafe space, and she saw something that cut through her like cold steel. Fear. Raw, undeniable terror swimming in depths that had always seemed so controlled. His mouth moved soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Every instinct screamed at her to move. Livia abandoned the tray she'd been carrying, weaving between tables with singular focus. The distance felt endless, each step stretching into eternity, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Sir, can you hear me?" She knelt beside his chair, her voice steady despite the chaos exploding inside her chest. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against some invisible weight pressing down on him. "My chest," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Feels like something's crushing me." Livia's hands found her phone with muscle memory born of necessity. Her fingers dialed 999, while her other hand instinctively reached for his, covering those trembling fingers with her own warmth. The emergency operator's voice seemed to come from very far away as she provided the cafe's address, described the symptoms, answered questions with clinical precision that surprised her. "Help is coming," she whispered to Gideon, squeezing his hand with gentle pressure. "You're going to be okay. I'm right here with you." Other customers had noticed the commotion now, but their voices faded into background noise. The world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this desperate fight against time that felt too short and too cruel. Gideon's grip on her hand tightened with surprising strength. "Thank you," he managed between labored breaths, "for seeing me, for caring." The words hit her like physical blows. How long had he been invisible to the world? How many people had looked through him rather than at him? Her throat constricted with emotion she couldn't name, wouldn't examine too closely. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Livia kept talking about the weather, about tomorrow's forecast, about anything that might keep him anchored to consciousness. His eyes remained fixed on her face, as if memorizing every detail. As if her presence was the only thing standing between him and darkness. The paramedics arrived in a rush of green uniforms and efficient urgency. Professional hands took over, checking vitals, asking medical questions, preparing equipment with practiced speed. But Gideon's eyes never left Livia's face, and his fingers remained intertwined with hers until the stretcher forced them apart. "Can I ride with him?" she asked the lead paramedic, surprising herself with the question. She barely knew this man, yet the thought of him facing this alone felt unbearable. "Are you family?" "Yes," she lied without hesitation. "He's my grandfather." The ambulance interior smelled of antiseptic and controlled emergency. Gideon lay strapped to the gurney, oxygen mask covering half his face, but his eyes remained alert, focused on her with an intensity that spoke volumes. Medical equipment beeped and hummed around them, marking time in electronic heartbeats. Livia held his hand throughout the journey, her thumb tracing gentle circles across his knuckles. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that space between crisis and hope, between stranger and family, something fundamental had shifted. She had acted without thinking, without weighing consequences, driven by instinct older than language. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital loading bay, Gideon squeezed her hand one final time. Behind the oxygen mask, she could see him trying to smile. His eyes held gratitude deeper than words could express. Recognition of a gift freely given when it mattered most. If this story is touching your heart, please like and share to spread the message that small acts of kindness can save lives in ways we never expect. The emergency room doors swung open, and everything changed forever. Recovery transformed Gideon from stranger to fixture in Livia's daily landscape. The heart attack had weakened his body but strengthened something indefinable between them. A connection that grew roots in the fertile ground of shared vulnerability. He returned to the morning brew 3 weeks later, moving more slowly but carrying himself with renewed purpose. "Doctor says I need more social interaction," he announced with a wry smile that didn't quite hide the deeper truth. Apparently, isolation isn't good for healing hearts. Their conversations expanded beyond weather and newspapers into territories that felt sacred. Gideon spoke of Helen, his wife of 43 years, whose laughter had filled rooms that now echoed with silence. He described mornings when she would hum while making breakfast, how she read mystery novels aloud during his evening baths, the way her hand felt in his during their final hospital vigil. "She made me promise to keep living," he confided one afternoon, his weathered fingers tracing patterns on the table. "But I forgot how until you reminded me." Livia began visiting his modest flat on weekends, initially under the pretense of checking on his recovery. The small space held decades of careful preservation. Helen's reading glasses still resting on her favorite chair, photographs covering every available surface, a chess set positioned as if waiting for an opponent who would never return. "Helen taught me to play," Gideon explained, gesturing toward the board. "She was ruthless, never let me win out of pity." They developed their own ritual. Saturday afternoons became chess lessons, punctuated by stories that painted pictures of lives well lived and love deeply cherished. Gideon's strategic mind remained sharp as ever, but he approached each game with gentleness that spoke of someone who had learned that winning mattered less than connection. Livia discovered that listening to his memories helped ease her own loneliness. Her tiny bedsit felt less cramped when she could escape into tales of garden parties and anniversary celebrations, of Christmas mornings filled with children's laughter and quiet evenings spent reading together by the fire. "You have her gift," Gideon observed one afternoon, watching Livia arrange the chess pieces with careful attention. Helen could make anyone feel like family within minutes of meeting them. The compliment settled in her chest like warmth from a perfect cup of tea. Family. The word had become complicated since leaving Prague, tangled up with distance and disappointment and dreams that required sacrifice. But here, in this small flat filled with evidence of enduring love, family felt possible again. Spring arrived with unusual gentleness, filling Gideon's windows with golden light that transformed dust motes into dancing stars. On a particularly radiant afternoon in April, he moved with unusual purpose, retrieving a sealed envelope from a drawer that had remained untouched throughout their friendship. "Livia," he said, his voice carrying weight that made her look up from the chessboard. "I need to tell you something important." The envelope felt substantial in his weathered hands, official in a way that suggested lawyers and documents and decisions that couldn't be undone. He set it on the table between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "That day in the cafe, when my heart decided to give up," he began, his eyes fixed on hers with intensity that made breathing difficult. "I was ready to let it happen. Do you understand? I was tired of waking up alone, tired of conversations with photographs, tired of carrying on for someone who would never come back." Livia felt tears building behind her eyes, but remained silent, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever courage had brought them to this moment. "But you saw me," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Not as burden or nuisance or pathetic old man, but as someone worth saving. You held my hand and made me remember what it felt like to matter to another human being." His fingers trembled as he pushed the envelope toward her. "Helen and I never had children. This house, everything we built together, it's been waiting for purpose, for someone who understands that homes are meant to shelter love." The deed inside revealed property valued at £650,000, a 3-bedroom house with garden space and morning light that would make even difficult days feel manageable. Livia's hands shook as she read her own name written in careful legal script, designation that felt impossible to comprehend. "I don't understand," she whispered, though understanding crashed over her in waves that left her breathless. "This is too much. I can't accept." "You saved my life," Gideon interrupted gently. "Not just my body, but my soul, my spirit, My belief that kindness still exists in a world that had grown cold and indifferent. Tears fell freely now, landing on official papers that represented security beyond her wildest imagination. The weight of his generosity felt enormous, terrifying, transformative in ways that extended far beyond financial relief. "This house has been empty too long," he said, covering her hands with his own. "Helen always said homes die without laughter. Promise me you'll fill it with joy." Through her tears, Livia saw not just shelter and stability, but recognition of something she had always known, but never dared believe. That caring for others was its own form of wealth, and sometimes the universe found ways to honor such riches. Gideon passed on a quiet Tuesday morning in late September, slipping away in his sleep with the same gentle dignity that had marked his final months. Livia found him when she arrived for their usual chess match, peaceful expression suggesting he had finally rejoined the woman who had waited 43 years for his return. The funeral drew exactly 7 people to the small chapel in Harrow. Livia sat in the front pew, clutching the deed that had become both blessing and burden, surrounded by the profound silence that accompanies genuine grief. She had expected this day, prepared herself for loss, but nothing could have readied her for what followed. They emerged from shadows like carrion birds circling fresh tragedy. Marcus Thornwell arrived first, introducing himself as Gideon's cousin with expensive solicitor in tow. Behind him came Dorothy Marsh, claiming friendship spanning decades, her sharp eyes assessing everything with calculating precision. Neither had attended the funeral, but both appeared within hours of the burial, armed with legal documents and righteous indignation. "This is highly irregular," Marcus declared, his Savile Row suit and Oxford accent marking him as someone accustomed to having his opinions matter. Uncle Gideon clearly wasn't in his right mind during those final months. Dementia, perhaps. Certainly confusion brought on by medication and loneliness. Dorothy nodded with theatrical sympathy. "Poor dear Gideon, taken advantage of by someone who preyed on his vulnerability. It's heartbreaking, really, how some people exploit the elderly." The words hit Livia like physical blows. Exploitation, manipulation, predation, legal terms that transformed months of genuine affection into something sordid and calculated. She clutched the deed closer, remembering Gideon's clear eyes on that spring afternoon, the deliberate way he had spoken about purpose and love and homes meant to shelter joy. The legal proceedings began 3 weeks later in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and broken promises. Marcus and Dorothy painted their case with broad strokes of elderly vulnerability and fortune-hunting foreigners, their legal team presenting a narrative that reduced Livia's care to calculated investment in future profit. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," their barrister proclaimed with practiced outrage, "we're dealing with a classic case of undue influence. A lonely, grieving widower, compromised by recent cardiac events and prescribed medications, falls prey to someone who recognized opportunity in his isolation." Livia sat beside her court-appointed solicitor, watching her life dissected by strangers who had never seen Gideon arrange chess pieces with trembling hands or listened to him speak Helen's name with reverence that made ordinary words sacred. The legal process transformed their bond into evidence, their conversations into suspicious manipulation, their genuine affection into calculated deception. When called to testify, she spoke with quiet conviction about Saturday afternoons spent listening to decades of love stories, about the way Gideon's eyes lit up when describing Helen's garden, about his clear intention to ensure his home wouldn't die with him. Her voice remained steady even as hostile questions painted her as opportunistic immigrant who had seduced a vulnerable man with false promises of care. "You arrived in this country with nothing," Marcus's barrister stated with accusatory precision. "Desperate for financial security, working multiple jobs to avoid eviction. Isn't it convenient that you befriended the one customer who happened to own valuable property?" "I befriended him because he was lonely," Livia replied, her accent thickening under stress. "Because everyone deserves to matter to someone. Because caring for others costs nothing, but makes everything worthwhile." The prosecution presented medical records showing Gideon's medications, expert testimony about depression's impact on decision-making, character witnesses who testified to his isolation and grief-driven confusion. They built a fortress of reasonable doubt around his final wishes, arguing that no sound mind would leave substantial property to a virtual stranger. Livia's defense felt thin by comparison. A few cafe customers who had witnessed their friendship, the original deed with its careful legal language, her own testimony about months of growing connection. The law required clear evidence of sound mental state, documented relationship history, proof of legitimate affection, rather than calculated manipulation. Have you ever witnessed injustice that made you question everything you believed about fairness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and they help others feel less alone in their struggles. The verdict arrived on a gray morning that reminded Livia of that first day when Gideon had appeared in her cafe. The judge's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything that followed. While the court acknowledges the plaintiff's genuine affection for the deceased, his honor pronounced with judicial detachment, the evidence suggests that Mr. A. Thornwell's mental capacity during his final months was compromised by grief, medication, and social isolation. The original will, executed when he was demonstrably of sound mind, must take precedence over documents created during a period of documented vulnerability. The house would go to Marcus. The legacy Gideon had carefully crafted would be dissolved into legal fees and property taxes, and distant relatives who had never bothered to visit during his loneliest years. Justice apparently meant protecting the dead from their own generous impulses, even when those impulses had been their most authentic expressions. Livia felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Not hope, exactly, but faith in systems designed to honor human connection over legal precedent. She had saved a man's life only to watch strangers dismember his final wishes with surgical precision. The courtroom emptied around her, leaving only echoes of a battle she had never been equipped to win. For 3 weeks after the verdict, Livia couldn't bring herself to enter the morning brew. The familiar space felt haunted by conversations that would never continue, by the empty corner table that no one else seemed willing to claim. She spent those days in her bedsit, staring at walls that pressed closer each hour, wondering if Marcus had already sold the house where she had learned what family could feel like. The loss cut deeper than financial disappointment. Gideon's final wishes had been dismissed as delusion, their bond reduced to legal footnotes about vulnerable elderly and opportunistic strangers. Every shared chess game, every story about Helen's garden, every moment of genuine connection had been transformed into evidence of manipulation that never existed. But grief has its own timeline, and slowly, through the fog of devastation, clarity began to emerge. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the verdict, the same day of the week when Gideon used to arrive at 8:15, Livia found herself walking past his old house. The garden looked different already, neglected in ways that would have broken his heart. Standing there, she finally understood what he had really given her. Not property or financial security, but something far more valuable. The knowledge that caring for others was never wasted effort, even when systems failed to recognize its worth. His true inheritance wasn't written on any deed. It lived in the way he had taught her to see loneliness and respond with presence. The Harrow Community Center needed volunteers for their elderly outreach program. Livia signed up that afternoon, driven by instinct older than logic. If the legal system couldn't honor Gideon's belief in human connection, she would honor it through action. Her first assignment was visiting Mrs. Chen, a widow whose children lived in Australia and called twice yearly on birthdays. The small flat smelled of medicinal tea and accumulated solitude, but Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up when Livia arrived with a chess set tucked under her arm. "You play?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice rusty from disuse. "A friend taught me," Livia replied, setting up the familiar pieces that carried memories of spring afternoons and stories about love that endured beyond death. Week after week, her circle expanded. Mr. Patel, who spent days watching game shows because silence had become unbearable. Margaret Thompson, whose arthritis made simple tasks mountainous but whose mind remained sharp as winter air. Each visit revealed the same fundamental truth Gideon had shown her. Everyone deserves to matter to someone. The program coordinator noticed her impact immediately. "You have a gift," she told Livia during one of their monthly reviews. "These aren't just visits for you, they're relationships. You see people, not cases." The observation echoed Gideon's words about kindness being its own form of wealth. Slowly, Livia began to understand that he had left her something more valuable than property. A purpose that transformed her immigrant struggles into immigrant strength, her financial limitations into unlimited capacity for human connection. 6 months later, she returned to the Morning Brew as assistant manager, her volunteer work having led to recommendations that opened doors previously locked. The corner table remained empty during Tuesday and Thursday mornings, her request to management honored without question. Sometimes she placed a single white teacup there, steam rising like incense for bonds that transcended legal documentation. Regular customers began sharing their stories with her, drawn by the same quality that had connected her to Gideon. The elderly businessman worried about retirement loneliness, the young mother struggling with postpartum isolation, the university student far from home and family. Each conversation became opportunity to offer what Gideon had taught her: the radical gift of being truly seen. Years passed, and Livia's life filled with richness that no inheritance could have provided. She had learned Gideon's secret, that wealth accumulated through countless small acts of recognition, through choosing connection over convenience, through believing that every human being carried stories worth hearing. Marcus had inherited a house, but Livia had inherited something infinitely more valuable: the understanding that every smile she shared became a 1,000-pound note in life's true currency. Every moment of genuine care and investment that paid dividends in ways no bank could measure. Gideon's real legacy lived not in property deeds, but in the expanding circles of compassion that rippled outward from a small cafe in Harrow, proving that some gifts grow more valuable when given away. Subscribe for more stories about extraordinary, ordinary people who discover that the smallest acts of kindness can create the greatest transformations. Because everyone has the power to change someone's world. Sometimes, you just need to remember how.